This video is audio content only. It does not contain any video footage or images. If you are expecting visual content, please be aware. This is intentionally provided in an audio-only format. We recommend listening to the audio rather than watching the screen. Thank you for your understanding. The world we inhabit is held together by a fragile logic, one that often frays at the edges of the mundane. Welcome to Kaidan 4. In these accounts, the familiar, a neighborhood trash collection, a child's sandbox, a quiet drive home, shifts into something unrecognizable. These are the echoes of a reality that has begun to rot from the inside out, where the shadows don't just follow, they participate. Settle in and pay attention to the silence. Sometimes the things we can't see are the only things that are real. Chapter 1: The Black Bags. The Constituent Services Department at City Hall is, for all intents and purposes, the city's dumpster. Overhanging branches from a neighbor's tree, dogs barking in the middle of the night, a dirty park bench, a never-ending stream of complaints that aren't quite police matters lands on my desk every single day. At first, I thought that day's complaint was just another case of illegal dumping. The caller was an elderly woman living in a quiet, upscale neighborhood on the north side of town. There are black trash bags being left at the neighborhood collection point, and it's not even pickup day, she told me. One more appears every single night. It's creepy. Please have someone from the city take care of it. I swallowed a sigh and headed out to the address she gave me. The collection area was a small nook enclosed by a low brick wall. Just as she'd described, 5 thick, heavy-duty black bags were lined up in a neat, orderly row. You couldn't see what was inside. I pulled on my work gloves and reached down to grab the knot of one bag, looking for any evidence of who might have dumped it. But the thing was unnervingly heavy. I couldn't even budge it with one hand. I had to brace myself and heave with all my strength just to lift it an inch off the ground. It felt like it was filled with solid lead or heavy stone. Suspicious, I took a utility knife and made a small slit in the side of the plastic. A pile of damp, pitch-black soil spilled out onto the pavement. A powerful, nauseating stench hit me immediately. A mix of sickly sweet rot and the metallic tang of old iron. It wasn't potting soil, and it didn't look like anything from a construction site. Every instinct in my body screamed that this was something foul, something that should never be touched. I headed straight back to my office and called the one person I knew who might make sense of this, Gabe. He's been my best friend since we were kids, and he's the young pastor at the historic stone church that's overlooked this valley for generations. Despite his family's religious background, Gabe is a deeply logical man. But he has a troubling knack for deconstructing things using what he calls the logic of the other side, a world I usually can't see. 20 minutes later, Gabe pulled up on his bike, dressed in casual clothes. He took one look at the black soil spilling out of the torn bag and stopped dead in his tracks. "Tell me you didn't touch that with your bare hands," he said, his voice low and serious. I shook my head. He looked around the area, pointing to the trees lining the street and the brick wall behind the bags. "Look closer," he said. "Look at the perimeter where these bags are sitting." I saw it then. Only in the immediate circle around those 5 bags, the moss on the brick wall had turned a bruised, oily black. The grass at the base of the trees was completely shriveled and dead. Even though there wasn't a hint of a breeze that afternoon, that specific corner of the street felt heavy, wrapped in an unnatural silence, as if the air itself had stopped breathing. "Someone isn't just dumping dirt here," Gabe said, his face devoid of emotion. "They're swapping it." I stared at him, confused. "What do you mean?" "Someone is coming out here night after night, digging up the earth of this neighborhood and bagging it. Then they're filling the holes with this rotting soil brought over from the other side. They're trying to rewrite the very foundation of this place. Who would do that, and why?" I asked. To find out, we decided to stake out the spot. We parked my car in a vacant lot with a clear view of the trash enclosure and waited in the darkness, keeping our voices low. It was just after 2 in the morning when we heard it. A heavy, rhythmic creaking sound, like metal wheels straining against the asphalt, approached from the shadows of the residential street. A man emerged into the dim glow of the streetlights, pulling an old, rusted garden cart. He was wearing faded work clothes. He stopped in front of the enclosure and unloaded a fresh black bag from the cart. Then he pulled out a well-worn shovel and began to dig into the ground with practiced, silent efficiency. The man shoveled the original dirt into an empty bag, and then, with a strange tenderness, he opened the new bag he'd brought and carefully filled the hole with that foul, black soil. He moved with a sense of devotion, as if he were meticulously tending to a prized garden. "Should I call the cops?" I whispered. As I started to reach for my phone, the man paused. He stopped his work and turned his face toward the street lamp. When I saw his profile, the blood drained from my face. It couldn't be. There was no mistaking him. Just 1 month ago, I was the one at City Hall who processed the paperwork for this man's estate after he was found dead, alone in his apartment. He was supposed to be dead and buried. "That's him," I whispered, my voice trembling. "That's the man from the apartment on 4th. I handled his final arrangements myself." Gabe remained perfectly calm. "He's not a man of this world anymore," he said quietly. "He either doesn't realize he's dead, or he refuses to accept it." Gabe watched the figure in the dark. "He's trying to rebuild his home. He's painting over this town with the soil of the dead, trying to create a place where he can finally belong again." The man lowered his head to return to his task, and for a second the light hit him directly from the front. His mouth was stretched open unnaturally wide, and inside his mouth, packed tight into every available space, was a mass of that same suffocating black dirt. Chapter 2. The View from Within. I had no idea how far I'd strayed from the trail. My phone's GPS had given up long ago, leaving me staring at a blank, useless screen. I practically slid down a steep, damp slope through a thicket of pines until I tumbled into a clearing at the bottom of a deep ravine. There, huddled together as if trying to hide from the world, were about a dozen old timber cabins. There wasn't a soul in sight. But the moment I stepped into the clearing, a cold shiver crawled up my spine, starting from the soles of my feet. Every single window, porch, and doorway had been sealed shut with thick wooden planks, completely rejecting the light from outside. And those planks, the walls themselves, were covered in countless holes. Small, jagged circles, maybe an inch or two wide, peppered the exteriors of the houses like a spreading rot. As I stood there, paralyzed by the sight, I felt a prickling sensation on the back of my neck. Even though the air was dead still, the hair on my arms stood up. I was being watched. From every direction, 1,000 invisible eyes seemed to be boring into me. "Don't look up." The voice came out of nowhere, and I flinched, nearly losing my balance. A young man in hiking gear was crouching in the shadow of a rotting eave. He was leaning forward, his face inches from the dirt, breathing in ragged, heavy gasps. "They're watching from inside," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Whatever you do, don't look into the holes." Before I could even process what he was saying, my skin crawled with a sudden, primal realization. Back there, in the depths of those holes, in that absolute darkness, countless eyes were staring back at me. The pressure of their gaze was suffocating, like a physical weight pressing against my chest. "I looked," the man said, his hand suddenly clamping onto my ankle. His grip was ice cold, like a hand pulled from a freezer. "My legs, they won't move the way I want them to. They're pulling me in." Suddenly, his body jerked upright, moving with the unnatural stiffness of a marionette. He was fighting it, his face contorted in terror and his muscles straining, but his feet began to move on their own. He was being marched toward the largest of the derelict cabins in the center of the clearing. I couldn't move. I couldn't even scream. I just watched as he reached the wall, and a section of the boarded-up front door swung inward. A mouth of pure shadow opened up. The man was sucked into the darkness, disappearing in an instant. Then the boards swung shut again, silent and final. Silence rushed back in, so heavy it made my ears ring. Panic finally took over, and I turned to run back the way I'd come, but my feet tangled, and I slammed hard onto the gravel path. When I looked up, I found myself staring directly into a hole in the wall of a small shack. Deep in the dark, a single, wide-open eye met mine. In that moment, something that wasn't words flooded into my brain. I want to see the outside from the inside. I don't know if the thought was mine or theirs. All I knew was that being outside suddenly felt terrifyingly exposed. I felt vulnerable, naked under the sky, as if the open air itself was a threat. I stood up slowly. I wanted to be in there, in the dark, in the safety of the interior. My legs began to move, driven by that lone, singular desire. Now I am inside. The light can't reach me here. I spend my time carving into the wood, making new holes to peer through. I'm waiting to spot someone walking by out there. I'm waiting for our eyes to meet. I have to pass this on. I have to make them see. Chapter 3. The Wooden Boy. When you're driving down rural back roads, you'll often see those child-shaped caution signs. They're the wooden cutouts that say, "Slow down," or "Children at play," meant to keep drivers from speeding through residential pockets. When I first started my career, my commute took me through a winding stretch of road in the foothills where several of those signs had been installed. But these weren't official county signs. Every single one of them had been handmade by a man named Elias Thorne. A few years prior, Elias's young son had been killed in a hit-and-run on one of those sharp curves. The driver was never found. Consumed by grief, Elias quit his job and spent every waking hour carving those wooden cutouts. He placed them all along the perimeter of the accident site, a silent army of warnings to anyone passing through. 6 months later, he took his own life. About a year after his death, the rumors started. People said the faces on the signs were changing. The painted-on smiles were warping into jagged, agonizing screams. Sometimes, they said, the face of the child would be replaced by the weathered, furious features of a grown man. One night, during a heavy downpour, I had to slam on my brakes. One of the cutouts was lying face down in the middle of the road. I didn't want anyone to hit it and swerve, so I stepped out into the rain to move it. But the moment I grabbed the edge, I felt a jolt of pure wrongness. It didn't feel like plywood. It was the sensation of cold, clammy flesh. I flipped it over, and my heart nearly stopped. Elias Thorne's face, the face of the man who had hanged himself, was bulging out from the surface of the wood. His features were distorted, pressed against the grain, as if he were trying to break through from the other side. Then his eyes snapped open and looked directly at me. A split second later, a massive semi-truck roared around the bend, its tires screaming as it pulverized the cutout into splinters. The truck hissed to a stop a dozen yards away. The driver leaned out of his cab, his face pale in the rain. "Don't touch it," he barked, his voice shaking. "If you touch them, they'll take you with them." Chapter 4. The Sandbox. The Sandbox. The children played. among the leaves, among the stones. But one day a strange thing happened. They were playing in the sandbox. A sandbox of death. The children forgot who they were. They were scared, but unable to move. The Constitute Services office is tucked away in the north corner of the first floor of City Hall, the part of the building that the sun never quite reaches. As I've mentioned before, we're the catch-all for every grievance in the city. From neighborhood feuds to people calling to report that the shapes of the clouds look menacing, everything eventually lands on my desk. The call came in on a humid afternoon in mid-June. There are bones, animal bones, I think, buried all over the sandbox in the park near my house, a woman's voice said, sounding more annoyed than frightened. It sounded like a typical case of a stray dog or a cruel prank. I grabbed my gear and headed out to the site. The park was an old, weathered place with rusted swings and overgrown grass. I stepped into the center of the large sandbox and began to dig with a small hand shovel. Almost immediately, I hit something hard and white. It wasn't a bone. It was a tooth. And it wasn't just one or two. Every time I pushed the shovel into the sand, dozens more surfaced. I called Gabe. He arrived shortly after, and together we spent the next hour digging like men possessed. By the time we stopped, we had a small mountain of hundreds of teeth piled on the grass. Gabe picked one up, examining it closely under the afternoon sun. "These aren't real bone," he said, his brow furrowed. "They're replicas, incredibly detailed, but synthetic. Like they were molded out of the sand itself." But that wasn't the unsettling part. Gabe began to sort them, laying them out on a flat stone nearby. He had a strange, methodical focus as he pieced them together. "There are 5 complete sets here," he said, his voice dropping an octave. 5 perfect human dental records. He looked at the sets, then at the notes I'd taken. One of the patterns was a perfect match for the woman who had called in the complaint. I decided to stop by her house on the way back to the office. Her name was Mrs. Gable, a polite woman who lived just across from the park. She greeted me at the door with a wide, friendly smile. The moment she opened her mouth, my blood turned to ice. Her gums were completely bare. Every single tooth was gone, leaving nothing but smooth, empty pink flesh. But she didn't seem to notice. She kept talking, her voice sounding perfectly normal, as if she were still articulating against a full set of teeth. I backed away and found Gabe waiting by the car. "The Sandbox is mimicking us," Gabe said, staring back at the playground. "It's copying human data, piece by piece. And the moment the replica is finished in the sand, the original part vanishes from the person." He looked down at the final set of teeth he had arranged on the stone. "This last set," he whispered, "it's yours." I felt a sudden hollow lightness in my jaw. I reached up and pushed my fingers into my mouth. My teeth were gone, every last one of them. Chapter 5. The Weight of Silence. Back in college, my friend Kyle and I were driving home after a long weekend of skiing in the mountains. It was well after midnight. We were navigating a winding pass, the kind of road that feels like it's being swallowed by the forest. A thick, heavy fog had rolled in, reducing our world to the few yards illuminated by my headlights. Suddenly, a massive, towering shadow loomed in the middle of the road. I slammed on the brakes, the tires screaming against the cold asphalt. I braced for the impact, certain we were about to plow into whatever it was. But Kyle just stared straight ahead, his voice flat. "There was nothing there," he said. "It was just the fog." Strangely, there had been no thud, no jolt of a collision. I sat there for a moment, my heart hammering against my ribs, before I slowly eased off the brake and kept driving. As we continued down the mountain, I noticed Kyle was acting incredibly strange. He was drenched in a cold sweat. His hands were shaking violently in his lap, and he refused to turn his head even an inch in my direction. He just stared fixedly out the windshield, his jaw locked tight. When we finally reached the outskirts of town and pulled in to a brightly lit gas station, Kyle practically threw himself out of the car. He collapsed by a trash can, retching. I walked over to him, confused and worried. "Kyle, what's wrong? Was it the near miss?" He looked up at me, his face pale and gaunt in the fluorescent light. "Did you really not see it?" he whispered. Then he told me the truth. We hadn't hit that shadow. We had driven right through it. But the shadow hadn't stayed on the road. It had come inside the car with us. For the last hour and a half, Kyle said, his voice trembling, it was sitting right there on your lap. He described a figure with a neck that was impossibly long, bent and folded like a broken hinge, so that its face could hang directly in front of mine. It had spent the entire drive peering into my eyes, watching me breathe. "If you say a word," it had whispered into Kyle's ear, "I'll cover his eyes." That was why Kyle had stayed frozen. He knew that if I realized what was sitting on me, if I panicked, or if the entity followed through on its threat, I'd lose sight of the road and kill us both. He had sat in a terrified, agonizing silence to keep me driving straight. Ever since that night, I can't get behind the wheel without a lingering sense of dread. Every time I'm driving alone on a dark road, I find myself reaching down, checking the air just above my legs. I'm always wondering if there's a weight on my lap that I just can't feel yet. We walk through our lives assuming the world is a finished product. We trust the ground to be earth, our memories to be static, and the empty spaces around us to be truly vacant. But if these accounts tell us anything, it's that the reality we inhabit is far more fragile than we care to admit. Perhaps the city is being rewritten beneath your feet, or the silence in your home is actually a held breath. Thank you for listening and for stepping into these shadows with me. As you return to your own world, take a moment to look at the things you usually ignore. The weight of the air, the stillness of the trees, the reflection that lingers just a second too long. Sometimes the truth isn't hidden. It's simply waiting for you to notice it.